90 days. That's how long it took Jasmine Carter to go from a confident 36-year-old woman, who trusted her own memory completely, to a woman sitting in her car outside a pharmacy in Atlanta, seriously considering asking a doctor if something was wrong with her mind. It started small. Keys that weren't where she'd left them. A dinner reservation she was certain she'd never made, appearing on the calendar in her own handwriting. A conversation with her husband, Derrick, about a work trip to Charlotte that he swore, with complete calm confidence, they'd discussed in detail the week before. A conversation Jasmine had absolutely no memory of at all. By day 40, her own mother was gently suggesting she talk to somebody. By day 60, her closest friend had started speaking to her in the careful, overly patient tone people use with someone they're worried about. By day 85, Jasmine genuinely, quietly believed she might be losing her mind. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until the final week of this story, was that every single one of those 90 days had been engineered. Every misplaced item, every misremembered conversation, every carefully planted seed of doubt in the minds of the people closest to her. Derrick Carter wasn't worried about his wife's mental health. He was building a defense. Because in 3 months, Jasmine was going to find out exactly where he'd really been spending his Thursday evenings for the past year. And Derrick needed to make absolutely sure that when she did, nobody would believe a single word she said. Before we get into exactly how Jasmine finally saw through all of it, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because I promise you the way this story ends is worth staying for. Like this video if you're already suspicious of Derrick, share it with someone who needs a reminder to trust their own instincts, and comment below with the time and the city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to day 1, to the exact moment Derrick Carter decided his wife's own mind was the biggest threat to the secret he was keeping. Jasmine Carter had spent 9 years building a marriage in Atlanta, Georgia, that looked, from every outside angle, like exactly the kind of partnership people quietly envied. She'd met Derrick at a mutual friend's housewarming party when she was 27, both of them at the beginning of their careers. Jasmine working in event planning, building a client list one wedding and corporate gala at a time, and Derrick just starting out at a mid-sized real estate development firm, ambitious and charming in the specific way that made people trust him almost immediately. They married 2 years later. Jasmine scaled back her event planning business over the following years, not because Derrick pressured her to, but because they genuinely mutually decided it made sense while they tried to start a family. A decision that, after 4 difficult years and 2 miscarriages, they'd eventually painfully set aside. Jasmine kept a smaller client roster after that, 3 or 4 events a year, enough to stay connected to work she loved without the exhausting pace of her earlier 20s. By the time this story begins, Derrick had become a senior project manager at his firm, overseeing several major developments across the Atlanta metro area. A promotion that came with longer hours, more travel, and Jasmine had noticed over the previous year, an increasing number of evenings where he simply wasn't home until well past dinner, always with a reasonable explanation, always apologetic, always bringing home a small gift or a genuine, tired kind of affection that made the growing absences easy enough to accept. Their friends often described the Carters as one of the steadier couples in their social circle, the kind of marriage other people pointed to when they talked about what they wanted for themselves eventually. Jasmine had leaned into that reputation more than she probably should have, she'd later admit, treating the strength of their marriage as something so settled, so proven over 9 years, that she'd stopped actively questioning it the way she once had in their early years together. She trusted Derrick completely. That trust, built patiently over nearly a decade, was exactly what made the following 90 days so devastating. Not simply because of what Derrick did, but because of how completely her own foundation of trust made her doubt herself instead of him. She had no reason, walking into what would become the first of 90 days, to suspect that any of it was anything other than exactly what it looked like. The first incident, the one Jasmine would later identify as day 1 of 90, though she had no way of counting it at the time, happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early spring. Jasmine came home from a client meeting to find her house keys sitting on the kitchen counter instead of the small dish by the front door where she'd kept them, without exception, for the entire 9 years of their marriage. She thought nothing of it initially, assumed she'd simply set them down differently that morning in a rush. The second time it happened, 4 days later, Jasmine paused a moment longer. She was certain, genuinely certain, that she'd placed her keys in the dish that morning. The same automatic motion she'd performed thousands of times over 9 years of marriage. "Did you move my keys?" she asked Derrick that evening, more curious than concerned. "Babe, I haven't touched your keys," Derrick said, glancing up from his laptop with an expression of mild, easy confusion. "You probably just set them down somewhere different without thinking about it. Happens to everybody." Jasmine let it go. It was a small thing. It didn't deserve the mental energy she was giving it. What she didn't know, and wouldn't know for another 86 days, was that Derrick had moved those keys himself, both times deliberately, during the 10 minutes each morning when Jasmine showered before work. A small, almost laughably minor act that meant absolutely nothing on its own, but that Derrick was counting on to compound slowly and visibly, alongside dozens of other small acts exactly like it. Over the following 3 weeks, the small inconsistencies multiplied, each one minor enough on its own to dismiss, but accumulating, slowly, into something Jasmine couldn't quite name yet, but had begun to feel, uneasily, in the back of her mind. A dinner reservation appeared on their shared calendar, written in Jasmine's own handwriting, for a restaurant she had no memory of booking. On a date she was fairly certain she'd told Derrick she had a client call. "You definitely made this," Derrick said, showing her the calendar entry, his tone patient, not unkind. "That's your handwriting, Jasmine. I remember you telling me about it last week." Jasmine stared at the handwriting. It did look like hers. She genuinely could not remember writing it. But the evidence sat right there in her own hand, undeniable, and she found herself doubting her own memory rather than the calendar entry itself. What Jasmine didn't know was that Derrick had spent almost a year, quietly, studying her handwriting from grocery lists and old birthday cards, practicing a passable forgery specifically for moments exactly like this one. Small enough details that any single instance seemed impossible to fake, precisely because faking something that specific seemed like far more effort than any reasonable person would suspect their own husband of putting in. Derrick had, in fact, begun planning this campaign nearly 2 months before Jasmine ever noticed her first misplaced set of keys. Not out of some elaborate long-term scheme from the very beginning of the affair, but as a specific, calculated response to a near miss that had genuinely frightened him. Alicia Marsh had texted him one evening while Jasmine was in the same room, a message that appeared, briefly, on his phone's lock screen before he could intercept it. Jasmine hadn't seen it clearly enough to read the content, only enough to ask, casually, who Alicia was. Derrick had answered smoothly in the moment, a colleague, nothing more, but the near miss had shaken him badly enough that he'd spent the following weeks thinking, with the same methodical precision he applied to his development projects at work, about exactly how to insulate himself from ever being caught again. His conclusion, arrived at with the same calculated logic he'd used to assess risk on a construction timeline, was elegantly simple and deeply cruel. If Jasmine's own credibility could be quietly, patiently eroded, then any future accusation she made, however accurate, would carry far less weight with the people around her. He didn't think of it, even privately, as gaslighting. He thought of it as risk management. A week later, Derrick brought up a detailed conversation about an upcoming work trip to Charlotte, referencing specific things Jasmine had supposedly said about hotel preferences and flight times, none of which Jasmine had any memory of discussing at all. "We talked about this Sunday night, right after dinner," Derrick said, his voice carrying just the faintest edge of concern now, a note he'd calibrated carefully over weeks of practice. "You seemed a little distracted lately, Jasmine. Are you doing okay?" That question, "Are you doing okay?" delivered with genuine-sounding concern, was the first deliberate seed Derrick planted directly in Jasmine's own mind, rather than simply manufacturing evidence around her. It worked exactly as he intended. Jasmine went to bed that night turning the question over and over, wondering, for the first time, if something might actually be wrong with her. By day 40, Derrick had expanded his campaign beyond Jasmine's own perception of events, into the perceptions of the people closest to her. A strategic escalation Jasmine had no way of detecting, because it happened entirely in conversations she wasn't present for. He called Jasmine's mother, Cynthia, under the guise of a casual check-in call, mentioning gently, almost reluctantly, that he'd noticed Jasmine seeming a little forgetful lately, and maybe more stressed than usual, carefully framing his concern as genuine worry from a loving husband rather than what it actually was. "I don't want to alarm you, Cynthia," Derrick said, his voice pitched perfectly between concern and restraint. "I just wanted you to know, in case she mentions anything to you. I think the stress from work has been getting to her more than she's letting on." Cynthia, genuinely fond of her son-in-law and with no reason whatsoever to doubt his sincerity, mentioned the conversation to Jasmine the following week, gently, carefully, exactly the way Derrick had hoped she would. "Baby, is everything okay? Derrick mentioned you've seemed a little stressed lately. You know you can talk to me about anything." Jasmine felt something cold settle in her stomach, hearing her own husband's careful concern reflected back to her through her mother's voice, confirming something she'd already, privately, begun to fear about herself. Derrick performed a similar, careful conversation with Monica, Jasmine's closest friend since college, mentioning offhandedly at a birthday dinner that he'd been keeping an eye on Jasmine, that she seemed a bit off lately, framing it always as loving concern, never as anything approaching an accusation. By day 60, both Cynthia and Monica had begun speaking to Jasmine in a tone she couldn't quite place at first, until she finally recognized it for what it was, the same overly patient, carefully gentle tone people use with someone they've quietly decided might not be entirely reliable anymore. Day 73 brought the incident that came closest to fully convincing Jasmine that something was genuinely, seriously wrong with her own mind. She woke at 2 in the morning, certain, absolutely certain, that she'd heard Derrick's phone buzz with a text message, followed by the specific sound of him slipping quietly out of bed and leaving the bedroom. She lay awake for nearly 20 minutes, listening, before finally getting up to check on him, finding him in the kitchen, seemingly unbothered, making himself a glass of water. "I heard your phone," Jasmine said. "Who texted you at 2 in the morning?" Derrick looked at her with an expression of genuine, patient confusion. "Jasmine, my phone's been on the charger in the living room this whole time. I got up because I was thirsty. I didn't hear anything buzz." Jasmine checked his phone herself, standing right there in the kitchen. No recent notifications. No missed calls. Nothing at all to support what she was absolutely certain she'd heard. She sat down at the kitchen table and began, quietly, to cry, not from any single incident, but from the accumulated weight of 90, no 73, at that point, days of small, undeniable seeming evidence that her own perception of reality could no longer be trusted. Derrick sat down across from her, took her hand, and said, with what appeared to be genuine tenderness, "I think we should talk to somebody, babe. A doctor. Just to make sure everything's okay. There's no shame in that." What Jasmine didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table believing herself to be losing her grip on reality, was that Derrick's phone actually had received a text message 12 minutes before she woke up, from a woman named Alicia Marsh, a colleague at his firm, reading simply, "thinking about Thursday already. Can't wait. Derrick had deleted it, along with dozens of others exactly like it, the moment he'd heard Jasmine stirring. It was, ironically, the suggestion of seeing a doctor that finally, slowly, began to unravel Derrick's entire 90-day campaign, though not in the way he'd intended. Jasmine agreed to make an appointment, genuinely frightened enough by that point to want real answers about her own mental state. While gathering her medical records for the appointment, going through old files and insurance paperwork in their shared home office, she came across something that had nothing to do with her own health at all. A credit card statement, printed months earlier and long forgotten in a drawer, showing a series of charges Jasmine didn't immediately recognize, all from a restaurant downtown called Marchetti's, all on Thursday evenings, going back nearly a full year. She stared at those charges for a long time, something shifting slowly in her chest, not the familiar, exhausting doubt of the past 90 days, but something closer to the return of her own clear-eyed instincts, the ones she'd spent 3 months slowly, carefully talked out of trusting. She thought about every Thursday evening over the past year when Derrick had come home late, always with a reasonable explanation, always slightly distracted, always smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't his own. For the first time in 90 days, Jasmine didn't doubt herself. She got curious instead. Jasmine made a decision that afternoon that would define the following 3 weeks of her life. She stopped trying to prove her own sanity to anyone, and started, instead, quietly documenting everything, exactly the way she would have handled any professional problem in her event planning career. Methodically, with evidence, without emotion clouding her judgment. She began keeping a private notebook, hidden inside a box of old client files Derrick had no interest in, recording every single incident of the past 90 days she could remember, in as much detail as possible, alongside dates and times. She started noticing patterns she'd been too disoriented to see clearly while she was still doubting her own perception. That the misremembered conversations always happened on nights Derrick had been out late. That the misplaced items always seemed to shift during her 10-minute morning shower. That his concerned calls to her mother and Monica always followed closely behind incidents Jasmine herself had found most disorienting. She visited Marchetti's herself, on a Wednesday afternoon when Derrick was at work, showing his photo to a hostess who recognized him immediately, mentioning, without any prompting from Jasmine at all, that he came in almost every Thursday evening with his lady friend. A detail the hostess offered so casually that Jasmine understood, with a fresh wave of cold clarity, exactly how long this had likely been going on in plain sight. She hired a private investigator recommended by an old event planning client who worked in family law. A careful, discreet woman named Renata Solis who, within 8 days, had photographs, timestamps, and confirmation of exactly who Alicia Marsh was, exactly how long the affair had been going on, and crucially several photographs of Derrick's phone screen, captured through a long lens outside Marchetti's, showing text message threads Jasmine would later use to understand exactly how, deliberately her own reality had been manipulated for the past 90 days. Renata's report, delivered to Jasmine on a Sunday afternoon in a plain manila envelope, contained one detail that struck Jasmine harder than almost anything else in the entire investigation. A time-stamped photograph from 6 weeks earlier, showing Derrick and Alicia leaving Marchetti's together, laughing, entirely at ease, taken on the exact same evening Jasmine had woken at 2 a.m. convinced she'd heard his phone buzz. Renata's notes indicated Derrick hadn't come home until nearly midnight that night, nearly 3 hours after the dinner captured in the photograph had ended, meaning Jasmine's instinct that something was happening that night hadn't been confusion or imagination at all. It had been, Renata's report suggested, entirely, precisely accurate, Jasmine's mind working exactly as it always had, picking up on something real that Derrick had simply skillfully talked her out of trusting. Jasmine sat with that particular photograph for nearly an hour, before she could bring herself to move on to the rest of the file. Jasmine chose day 89, one day before what would have marked 3 full months of Derrick's campaign, to finally confront him. Not emotionally, not in the middle of an argument, but calmly, deliberately, with a folder of evidence laid out on the same kitchen table where he'd once told her, so gently, that she should see a doctor. "I want to show you something," Jasmine said, sliding the folder across the table. Derrick's confident expression faltered the moment he saw the first photograph. Himself and Alicia Marsh, clearly intimate, clearly not colleagues catching up over a work dinner, time-stamped from 6 different Thursday evenings over the past 2 months. "Jasmine, I can explain. You're going to want to see the rest first," Jasmine said, and turned to the second half of the folder. Her own handwritten notebook, 90 days of documented incidents, laid out chronologically alongside Renata's investigation timeline, showing in undeniable, methodical detail, exactly how each memory lapse and misplaced item corresponded precisely to a lie Derrick needed covered. "You didn't think I was losing my mind, Derrick. You needed everyone around me to think I was losing my mind, so that when I eventually found this," she said, tapping the photographs, "nobody would believe a single word I said about it. You spent 3 months trying to destroy my own trust in myself, specifically so you could keep cheating on me without any consequences." Derrick sat in silence for a long moment, the practiced charm that had carried him through 90 days of careful manipulation finally, visibly, failing him entirely. What followed over the next several weeks unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even Jasmine, who had spent 3 months believing her entire reality was crumbling around her. She shared her documentation, carefully, selectively, without accusation, with her mother and with Monica, walking each of them through exactly what Derrick had done, showing them the specific timeline of his calls to them alongside the specific incidents he'd engineered. Both women, horrified at having unknowingly participated in Derrick's campaign, became fierce, immediate allies the moment they understood the truth. Cynthia, Jasmine's mother, called Derrick directly, something Jasmine hadn't asked her to do, but didn't discourage either. "You made me doubt my own daughter's mind," Cynthia told him, her voice steady with a controlled fury Jasmine had rarely heard from her. "I will never forgive you for that, regardless of anything else you did." Jasmine filed for divorce 11 days after that kitchen table confrontation, working with a family law attorney who specialized specifically in cases involving documented patterns of psychological manipulation. Jasmine's meticulous 90-day notebook, combined with Renata's professional investigation, providing exactly the kind of evidence that made the proceedings move faster and more decisively than either woman had initially expected. Alicia Marsh, when Jasmine's attorney reached out during discovery, provided an unexpected wrinkle to the entire situation. A statement, given somewhat reluctantly, indicating that Derrick had told her, throughout their affair, that his marriage was already effectively over, that Jasmine was emotionally unstable and increasingly difficult to live with, a narrative Alicia had genuinely believed until she was shown, during the legal proceedings, the actual scope and calculation behind what Derrick had been doing at home the entire time. Alicia ended contact with Derrick permanently within days of that revelation, unwilling, she said in her statement, to have any further association with someone capable of that level of deliberate cruelty toward another person, regardless of her own role in the affair itself. Derrick, for his part, offered a series of shifting explanations over those following weeks, that he'd never meant for things to go as far as they did, that the affair had just happened and spiraled beyond his control, that some deep, unexamined part of him had genuinely convinced himself he was protecting Jasmine rather than deceiving her. Jasmine listened to all of it. Once, in a single mediated conversation her attorney recommended she have for her own closure, and found that none of it, ultimately, changed anything about the 90 days he'd spent making her doubt her own mind. Jasmine Carter's divorce was finalized 8 months after that kitchen table confrontation. She kept their house, a detail that mattered enormously to her, given how deliberately Derrick had once tried to make that same house feel like a place where she couldn't trust her own perception of reality. She returned to event planning full-time, rebuilding her client roster faster than she'd expected, in part because Monica, feeling a particular kind of guilt for the months she'd unknowingly treated her closest friend with careful suspicion, became one of her most enthusiastic referral sources, sending client after client Jasmine's way as a quiet, ongoing act of amends. She kept the notebook, the same one that had once documented 90 days of manufactured doubt, tucked in a drawer in her home office, not as a wound to keep reopening, but as a reminder of something she now considered one of the most important lessons of her adult life. That her own instincts, however quietly, however persistently doubted by someone she trusted, had ultimately been right all along. "I spent 3 months thinking I was losing my mind," Jasmine said, in a conversation she later gave permission to share as part of this story. "It turned out I had the clearest mind in that entire house the whole time. I just needed to stop letting somebody else's lies convince me otherwise." She started, roughly a year after the divorce, quietly mentoring other women in her expanding social circle who described similar patterns in their own relationships, not as a formal practice, just as a woman who understood, more intimately than she'd ever wanted to, exactly how effective a determined, patient liar could be at making someone doubt the one thing they should never have to question: their own mind.
Please take a moment to subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up. It truly helps this channel grow. I appreciate your support.